Hey everyone, welcome to the April 25th, 2025 episode of On Iowa Politics. This week on the podcast, Ashley Hinson's Town Hall, immigration enforcement on Iowa's college campuses, and more potential gubernatorial candidate talk. Hello everyone, I'm Erin Murphy, the Des Moines Bureau Chief for the Gazette in Cedar Rapids. We got the whole roster with you this week. Joining us as Gazette Deputy Bureau Chief Tom Barton. Hello, Tom.
Hey.
Lead Des Moines Bureau Chief Marchel Hoff is with us. Hello, Maya.
Happy Friday, Erin.
We've got Sarah Watson of the Quad City Times. Hello, Sarah.
Greetings, Erin.
Jared McNett of the Sioux City Journal's here. Hello, Jared.
Hello, Erin.
And, of course, Todd. He is running Dorman. The Gazette columnist is here. Hello, Todd.
Greetings from El Salvador.
We wondered last week if that might happen.
Hey, keep it down, guys. There's a lot of gang members fighting back here, so I'm trying to keep them quiet.
Did you take out the toughest looking guy on the first night to exert your dominance?
No, I baked him a pan of brownies.
There you go.
Seemed to work.
All right. We're going to start this week's, speaking of immigration, on Iowa's college campuses. Better turn the serious note here, though. In recent weeks, we've been getting reports of some students' visas being revoked in Iowa. Maya, I want to start with you because you wrote a story sort of taking a big picture statewide look at this, and then we'll drill down on some specific examples with Sarah. But Maya, tell us about your story and just kind of broadly paint the picture of what's been happening across the state in the last few weeks.
Yeah, a lot has changed in the past week around this since I last reported on it, and we'll get to that after the overview. But so across the state over the last few months, a lot of student visas have been revoked, or students at Iowa public universities and private universities have seen their student visas revoked or their SEVIS status changed or terminated. It's been an ongoing thing. When I was reporting it out and asking universities, specifically the state's 3 top public universities, whether or not they have any students that have seen their immigration status change or have their visas revoked. All of them gave a pretty similar blanket statement where they have seen students impacted, but they're not able to provide further information for privacy reasons. But we do know at the University of Iowa, there was one announced student visa termination earlier in April, and then later the Graduate Student Union announced that there had been 5 student visas revoked. It was unclear whether or not those were in addition to or including the one that was announced by the university earlier that month. These student visa terminations, it was unclear who the students were to the public, why their visas were revoked. I know across the country, as we've seen this roll out, there have been a number of reasons why students are having their visas revoked, and some aren't sure why. Some are directly related to their involvement in campus protests to the war in Gaza. Others are for past
legal issues?
Past legal issues. I'm trying to think of the word. But so maybe DUI or a traffic ticket, something like that. Past infractions, there we go. And so it was really unclear why these ones at University of Iowa happened. We do know that there have been 2 revoked according to the Iowa State student newspaper. 2 visas were revoked, and that's because there was a lawsuit filed. And after I reported this out, the students at the University of Iowa filed a lawsuit. So we do know that went on there. When I asked the University of Northern Iowa whether or not this was the case, they said that some students were impacted. No visas had been terminated, but they have seen some changes to some of their students' immigration status. Just to kind of clarify, so there's a couple ways where students and their statuses can be changed. One is through just revoking their student visas. There's a couple different types. F1, which is the most common, it allows non-immigrant students to attend a certified school or program on a full-time basis until they graduate, and some visas allow for them to extend their time in the country if they gain post-graduation employment. And then some students haven't had their visas revoked, but they have seen a change in their SEVIS status, which is the Student Exchange and Visitor Information System records. And that's the system that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security uses to keep track of the status of international students in the country. And there's gray areas. I talked to an Iowa City immigration attorney, and he said there's a lot of gray areas and what these terminations could mean. Some folks say without having SEVIS status, they just lose their ability to be in the country, but others, there's gray areas where Trump administration officials have said they can still be allowed to stay in the country. So there's been a lot of gray on that. But since then, obviously the students have filed a lawsuit, but then a district court judge, according to the Iowa City Press Citizen, reported yesterday that a federal judge placed a temporary restraining order against the Trump administration, which would prevent the deportation of 4 University of Iowa students who had their visas terminated. So a lot going on. And then actually earlier today, the U.S. Justice Department lawyer said immigration officials have started to work on revising the system for revoking and terminating visas. And they're just stepping back and taking a look at that. And they said until that's complete, there's going to be no further changes to SEVIS status or visa terminations. So it's just changing day by day. And it's difficult to keep track of where student visas are being revoked, how many. These numbers could be different now. But as of now, according to Inside Higher Ed, there have been an identified 1,800 plus international students that have had their legal status changed by the State Department. So
that number is nationwide, right, Maya?
Nationwide,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
yes, yep, correct.
Yep. And by the way, when Maya says today, we're taping on Friday this week, so we're sitting here. That's as of Friday afternoon. And Maya raises a good point. This has been a very constantly in motion story. Sarah, the Quad City Times has been doing some great work on this too. Reported on a handful of private college students whose was impacted by this, and also I believe the Times broke the story on the state entering into an immigration enforcement agreement with the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, aka ICE. Tell us about those stories, Sarah.
Yeah, so credit goes to my colleagues Olivia Allen and Nina Baker for those stories. So first off, there's 5 students at Quad Cities private colleges that have had their student and exchange visitor information system statuses canceled. Like Maya talked about, the private colleges in the Quad Cities, there's St. Ambrose in Davenport, and then there's Augustana College in Rock Island. And so the Augustana president had sent out a message to students saying that these students that had been impacted at Augustana, that the terminations of their status were based on information related to criminal records, either ongoing or expunged, and that the impacted students were essentially needed to leave the country. And so that was the same for a few students at St. Ambrose. And then there's also a handful of students at Western Illinois University, which is the public university on the Illinois side. So that's kind of the situation in the Quad Cities with relation to student visas. And then then the task force. So Nina Baker, she covered this story as she's been reporting on immigration and its impact in the Quad Cities and in Iowa. So the Department of Public Safety entered into this agreement to form a task force of 3 Iowa special agents that would be authorized to enforce federal immigration laws. The Department of Public Safety says that this merely formalizes a long-standing relationship between the Iowa Department of Public Safety and federal agencies, such as the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees ICE. And it has this agreement, or it has these types of relationships with the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. But this agreement, Iowa is one of 10 states to have formalized an agreement like this, and it authorizes these special agents to interrogate and arrest without a warrant suspected undocumented immigrants during routine police activities. So they're essentially deputizing some of the immigration enforcement activities with these folks that are in the investigative unit, these 3 members. So in particular, the quote from the director's letter of interest to ICE says that the task force will enable the Iowa Department of Public Safety to, quote, assist in the identification and apprehension of illegal aliens who may pose a risk to public safety in Iowa, unquote. There's a program called the 287G Agreement, which allows local law enforcement agencies to train and partner with ICE. And this task force model goes further and authorizes the law enforcement agencies to assist in the investigations of people who are already arrested and booked into local jails. This seems to be the first 287G agreement in Iowa.
Good stuff. Thanks for that, Sarah. And if you haven't already, check out all this reporting that we're talking about here. Tom, I wanted to ask you real quick. Speaking of that agreement, we just got notice again. It's Friday afternoon here. I think this morning we got notice that an advocacy group is going to challenge that agreement in the courts, right?
That's correct. So, Escucha Vaz members, in coordination with the Iowa City Catholic Workers, held a press conference earlier this afternoon about a complaint that they have filed, arguing that Iowans' civil rights were violated under the Iowa Department of Public Safety's 287G task force agreement with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The complaint documents a prolonged traffic stop on April 18th near Dubuque, where this advocacy group for Iowa immigrants and migrants says that claims an Iowa state trooper stopped and held 7 Latino construction workers for nearly an hour. The advocacy group is arguing that essentially that stop amounted to racial profiling, and that under that task force agreement with ICE, that Iowa DPS troopers are only authorized to perform certain federal immigration enforcement functions if they are nominated, trained, certified, and acting under the direction and supervision of ICE. The agreement, they argue, prohibits independent immigration enforcement by untrained officers, and outlines a formal complaint process for civil rights violations. And so in the complaint, among the arguments that they make is that, these task force agreements, essentially, again, lead to using racial or ethnic profiling and initiating traffic stops as a pretext to check immigration status, and that, at least in the past in other states where these agreements have been used, that they've failed to provide an interpreter and have failed to disclose their authority to investigate and enforce immigration laws.
All right, so we'll have that now too, as again as an ever evolving part of this story. Good reporting by everybody. Get caught up, and we'll obviously be following that story as it continues in the coming days, weeks, and months. Okay, want to shift gears and move on. This week, we're back on the town hall beat. Eastern Iowa Congresswoman Ashley Hinson held her first public town hall of the 2025 calendar year. She's held at least one telephone town hall this year, but this was her first in-person public town hall. As we have now said repeatedly on the podcast, these things have been raucous this year. And Tom, it sounds like this one was no different.
Yeah, that's correct. So this was Ashley Hinson's first in-person town hall since the new Congress convened, since she was reelected to a third term following last fall's election. And yeah, she was met by a hostile crowd in Mason City. There were about 200 people that gathered in a large auditorium on the campus of North Iowa Area Community College, and the congresswoman was booed, heckled, and shouted at, excuse me, as she defended President Donald Trump's agenda. You could definitely tell that there were kind of some elevated tensions there, and it remains kind of a fiery town hall for the duration of the hour-long forum. Representative Hinson of Marion emphasized her support for Trump's policies, including border security, tax cuts, deregulation. She addressed concerns about immigration, advocating for comprehensive reform and self-deportation for illegal immigrants. She also discussed her bipartisan initiatives to improve government efficiency and support for veterans, and responded to questions on healthcare, Medicaid, and the impact of executive orders on federal employees. While at times there was kind of a smattering of supportive applause, the crowd largely was critical of the Trump administration and pressed Representative Hinson to stand up to him and to push back against the executive branch. One of the speakers, one of the attendees, a 70-year-old from Clear Lake, asked a pretty pointed question. He asked Representative Hinson, when will you and your Republican colleagues take back your legislative power to rein in President Trump? And that question was met with cheers from the audience. Hinson responded by saying that there's, probably a fundamental disagreement in this room on that issue, saying that when she looks at things and what Congress is doing, she believes that, they are working on executing exactly what they and President Trump campaigned on, last year leading up to last fall's general election. That didn't sit well with the crowd. She was often booed, and she was often drowned out, I should say, by boos and derisive outbursts. One person yelled, "You're lying," but she went on to argue that Americans overwhelmingly rejected the status quo in November, feeling that the country was on the wrong track and headed in the wrong direction, with high inflation, with a wave of illegal border crossings, and saying that hardworking men and women in Iowa and across the country felt like their voices were not being heard, and that families in Iowa want to have safe streets, affordable groceries, and gas, and make sure their kids have opportunities to live out the American dream, and said, quote, that's what President Trump and his team are delivering. Again, she was pressed or pushed by attendees, asking, I want to know what Congress is doing to stand up. There was a attendee from Decorah, a retired technology and biomedical industry professional, who said, or asked Hinson how she expects the United States to be able to compete in the world as Republicans waged what he called an absolute war on competence, a war on science, and a war on truth. And Hinson responded by highlighting the need to respect taxpayer dollars, to cut waste, and focus on policies that grow jobs in the private sector rather than growing the size of the federal workforce, and said that efforts by the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, to root out wasteful spending, inefficiencies, and fraud in the federal government frees up resources to ensure that federal services and benefits are strengthened and maintained, and that they go to those who need them most. There was one, I guess, notable interaction or point of the town hall where she was asked by an attendee, or I guess I should say was urged by an attendee, to support increased funding for immigration judges, so that we can give the hearings to those that that we wish to deport, according to the speaker. And Hinson blamed former President Biden and his administration, saying that they created a significant backlog of people who came to the country illegally, and said that she's not sure whether there are enough resources to dedicate to those hearings, and said that, quote, look, we've got so many pending immigration cases that if we had every single one of those, or if we allowed every one of those people to have an individual hearing, it would take 100 years. And that sparked outrage and shouting back from the crowd, including some who yelled due process. Sorry, one other notable exchange. There was a retired Army officer and VA employee from Cedar Rapids who raised concerns about job security and the impact of executive orders on federal workers, including the removal of collective bargaining agreements for VA employees under what he said is the guise of national security, and expressed, concerns about the firings of probationary employees, which has sparked a legal challenge, and said that he's concerned about the potential for being fired for political reasons and the impact on veterans who work at the VA from increased workloads due to firing, hiring freezes, and employee buyouts. And Hinson acknowledged the concerns, but emphasized the need for efficiency and accountability in government agencies, including at the VA, and reiterated her commitment to supporting veterans and ensuring that they have good jobs and access to necessary services. But that didn't quite, satisfy this retired Army officer and VA employee, who said, my question to you and for your office is, where is my representation? He said, I feel my representation, both by her and by Iowa's 2 U.S. senators, said that he felt that they haven't said a damn thing about all of this, and doesn't see the executive orders as being legal, but sees it as an abuse of power, and doesn't see, at least, Republican members of Iowa's federal delegation pushing back on any of that.
The Hinson line that you were talking about, Tom, of it would significantly slow things down in terms of deportations if every single one of them got a hearing. That's basically exactly what Trump and JD Vance in particular have both said. So that's not something that just is something that she is saying by herself.
Picked up the company line.
Right. Yeah. And that company line did not sit over well with with those who were in attendance at the town hall.
I was going to say, it's probably worth mentioning too that we also had another raucous Grassley forum this week. Yep. on Wednesday in Northwood, and from the AP story that I was reading about that, it sounds like the people there even were yelling at each other, which I thought was a pretty funny detail.
Yeah, you're right. I saw that story too, Jared, and that was a fascinating, and between that wrinkle in the AP story and I think it was Brianne at the Register who also covered it, and she reported that Grassley said, despite the sort of the tenor of some of these things, that he's planning to continue to do them. So that's encouraging from a government accountability standpoint, at least, that despite as intense as these things are getting. And I think Congresswoman Hinson said something similar, right, Tom, that she plans to do more, or am I imagining that?
No, you're right.
Okay.
She has said that she still plans to hold to her commitment to hold a town hall across the congressional district, to do a town hall in every county in the district. Sarah, you recently sat down with Congresswoman Marionette Miller Meeks and asked her about her plans for town halls. Can you share kind of your reporting on that?
Yeah. So she was at a private event in Bettendorf, and it was with the Americans for Prosperity, and I was invited to come cover it. And so I asked her there, what do you why haven't you held a public town hall? And she said that it was scheduling, and that it takes months to organize her schedule, and it that she would plan to hold a public town hall. So she did say she does plan to. She's held a virtual town hall like Ashley Hinson did, and then she told the group that she was planning another virtual town hall here sometime in the next week. I asked her, if she, and the other interesting thing, at least in Davenport, there have been a lot of protests at Miller Meek's offices, outside of events, like private events that she's had. I mean, there's been, at least more than like 4 or 5. Like there's been one at least like almost every week, maybe multiple a week, and people asking, urging her to hold a town hall. Actually, today there was one in front of her Davenport office for 8 hours. It was scheduled for, at least that's what the organizer said, that you could come anytime between this 8-hour period. So there has been a lot of energy and organizing energy among, Democrats and others as well, urging Marinette Miller Meeks to hold a town hall. And she told me Wednesday that yes, she does plan to hold a public in-person town hall.
And that's a perfect segue, Sarah, to something I wanted to go back to Tom to ask. I'm curious because you've been to a couple of these now. You covered the Grassley one, you covered the Hinson one. So I'm going to ask, have you been able to get a sense of, at the risk of oversimplifying, are these mostly Democrats showing up to these, or are you getting the sense that there's people who might not necessarily be dyed-in-the-wool Democrats and they're just concerned about these things? And I'm going to couch that for our listeners by saying, look, everybody, no matter who they voted for or whether they voted for or not, has a right to be upset with their represented government official. That's not what I'm getting at here. But I do think there's an interesting question here about, so there's clearly this anger amongst Iowans and across the country. And I'm just wondering, do we have a sense yet of, is the anger mostly coming from people who you would expect to be angry about a Republican administration's policies, or is that spreading beyond that? Do you have a sense, Tom, of the folks that are coming to these? Like I said, are they just mostly Democrats, or are you getting some maybe less traditional folks coming out to these kinds of events?
Yeah. So for the most part, from the people that I've talked to at these town halls, the majority of the outrage, right? The people who are screaming and jeering and heckling, are Democrats, right? The outrage is coming from the people you would expect that to come from over these Republican policies and over these actions from the Trump administration. But it should be noted, it's not just Democrats that are showing up at these town halls to voice concerns. Yes, the Democrats are the ones who are being, the most vocal and expressing the most outrage, but you also have independents and moderate Republicans showing up and, raising concerns about, again, potential impacts to Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And you've got veterans showing up and raising concerns about impacts to the VA and impacts to services to veterans. You have, some business leaders or small businesses, small business owners, and again, moderate Republicans expressing concerns about trade policies and tariffs and what the impacts are going to be on their communities and on Iowa's farmers and Iowa's ag industry. So look, yes, there is, a lot of palpable concern and anxiety and worry from a cross section of the Iowa electorate. It's just that the ones that are raising the most ruckus, I guess, are Democrats. But at Ashley Hinson's town hall yesterday, you did have independents and Republicans ask pointed questions. They weren't the ones yelling and shouting at her, but did ask some pretty poignant questions about the effects of things going on in DC.
Even if it were just all Democrats, it still is a different posture and a different way of handling things than I know even I've seen like in the past from Democrats in the state. So even if there was solely, dyed in the wool Democrats, it would still be worth noting, I would think.
And also, I wonder, from having covered these, Tom, if you think that it also prompts answers from the elected officials to, explain their reasoning, explain their stances on some of these issues that you might not otherwise get, even, for the broader publics that are just reading about these town halls.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. They're helping us out, right? Getting these folks to ask questions. All right, great stuff. Thanks, Tom, and I appreciate the reporting and the insight. That was awesome, and everybody. All right, let's move on. I want to bring in Jared next because this week, Western Iowa Congressman Randy Feenstra told the Des Moines Register that he is essentially keeping his options open regarding a potential run for governor in 2026. As our loyal podcast listeners know all too well, Republican Governor Kim Reynolds recently announced she will not seek re-election next year, opening the Republican primary floodgates and giving the On Iowa Politics podcast a lot to talk about for the next 18 months. Jared, it surprises me a little bit that Congressman Feenstra would think about giving up a pretty safe seat and job in Congress for an election bid that he wouldn't even be guaranteed to make out of the primary, much less be successful in the general election. But let me put that to you, knowing what you know about the congressman from having covered him. What do you make of this?
So, Erin, back in, and I talked about this on the podcast at the time, back in December 2023, I did a story about Representative Feenstra and the possibility of him endorsing someone in the 2024 Iowa caucuses. And I asked him about that at an event he did around the time. And he said, my job first and foremost is to be the ambassador to anybody who wants to come. Then whether I'll be endorsing, that'll come later. I want everybody to be open-minded. I don't want to dilute their thoughts. I want them to make a decision, and then maybe down the road we'll make that decision. And I say that because ultimately, in that case, a decision did not come. There was not any endorsement, and that was sort of that. And that was the kind of thing that I was thinking about with this. It's one thing to say, you're keeping an open mind about something, you're considering something. It's an entirely different thing to actually pull the trigger on something like that and go ahead with it.
Okay, so you don't read too much into that at this point, anyways.
No, not necessarily at this point. No, that's a pretty easy posture to take at this point. And then I will say, since I missed all of the fun from last week of you guys talking about the Reynolds announcement and everything, I definitely wasn't surprised by that announcement at all for a whole host of different reasons. If anything, I was surprised that a lot of people were so surprised by that.
Yeah, we covered that last week, and we all were surprised. But we also talked about, this will be especially valuable for people who may have missed last week's podcast. If you did hear last week's, you can press that skip ahead 30 seconds button on your player right now. There has been kind of within the the general thinking at the Golden Dome of Wisdom, as Todd has labeled it. There's been kind of a progression of thought on whether the governor would run for re-election, and for the longest time, the assumption was that she was not going to. To your point, Jared, it only surprised us all because that seemed to change around the time of the caucuses and into the election. And it really, that tone started to shift, and there started to be a more general consensus that she was, after all, going to run for re-election. And then we talked about that press conference in February where she was answering a question about the Brad Sherman, who had jumped in already, and she started using present tense verbs in her response, like "I'll be running on my conservative record." And that just kind of seemed to, at that point, confirm what had been more and more believed and accepted at the Capitol, which was that she was going to run again. But obviously, either that wasn't the case or it was for a while and she changed her mind back. But anyways, that's why there was a lot of surprise amongst those of us again. But again, it just proves that a lot of people can think something and be completely wrong. There's only one most reliable source in the world, right?
I will say too, to circle back to your original question and to do some crass horse race sort of stuff. I do have a hard time seeing exactly what kind of lane Representative Feenstra would occupy if he did run for governor. I think that's where he would have as tough a time as anything, because in his primary challenge last year, the person that ran against him, Kevin Virgil, kind of ran to his right, and you would certainly have people doing that in a Republican primary as well. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good point. And also, I'm just going to make a note for the archives here in the records. April 25th, 2025, first use of the term lanes in the 2026 midterm election. We are off and running, folks.
all about those lanes.
Todd, we've been talking about this already a little bit. And I think you said last week, correct me if I'm wrong, Todd, that you feel like Attorney General Brenna Bird would have a leg up in this primary if she chooses to run, in part because of her allegiance to and apparent support from President Trump. We just talked about Randy Feenstra. This week, State Senator Mike Busolo made it almost official by announcing he's created an exploratory committee. And I was a little surprised, honestly, by Agriculture Secretary Mike Naig on Iowa Press when we asked him about it. And he was, he didn't give up any kind of firm answer, but he just was willing to talk about it a lot more than I expected him to. He was really comfortable talking about his decision-making process and certainly far from ruled out a run. I'm just wondering, Todd, how big you think this field is going to be. We've talked about that this position has been, dominated by Terry Branstad and Kim Reynolds for the better part of 20 plus years in the party. What do you think that's going to unleash the fire hose here?
Well, I know for sure that Branstad's not going to come back and run for a 7th term.
He's not going to try and pad that record.
No, I don't
a few
think
more
so.
years. Okay,
and I think the lane that Randy Feenstra is in is tall. So I mean, there are probably volumes of the Iowa Code and stuff up on high shelves that he can grab, unlike any other governor.
I'm reminded of the Caddyshack quote: "If you don't keep score, how do you measure yourself against other golfers?" And the Chevy Chase character says, "By height."
Yeah, so that's what I know for sure right now is he would be the tallest candidate, I believe. But they're going to explore, and they actually maybe mean that in that they're going to, you've got your friends who say, "Oh yeah, you ought to run,"
Mm-hmm.
but then you need to go out and talk to the donors and the party leaders and the people who do the grassroots organizing and see if they think you should run for governor. And in some cases, they may say, I don't see a path for you. But Mike Busolo,
Bouchelot, it's pronounced sometimes with an sh.
I don't know if I've ever said it out loud. But he's trying to come out of the legislature, as a state senator, and that's only happened once in God, I don't know how many decades, and that was Tom Vilsack, who was a much higher profile lawmaker at the time than Bouchelot is. So Bouchelot, I'll have to figure this out. But so that's tough. You have the House Speaker Pat Grassley. You're world famous in the Capitol, but who knows outside? Although he's got the last name that people recognize, so that's an advantage. That'll get people to at least take a look at him if he's Chuck Grassley's grandson. But I still think Bird, just because she's won a statewide race, she has basically made the Attorney General's office into Donald Trump's law firm Iowa sector or whatever you want to call it, the Ministry of Justice. I don't know if that's fair, but so I still think she's the highest profile possibility. I know Naig has won like 2 or 3 times statewide, 3 maybe. Trying to remember.
And won a Republican primary, by the way, in a different time.
Yeah, yeah.
But did win a Republican primary for that.
But I don't, I don't get a sense from him, and this could be totally wrong, but I don't know that he has the sort of the killer instinct that you need to run for governor now.
Todd, you were also talking about, people not necessarily knowing who someone is. I don't know that most people know who that is.
No, I mean, unless, if you work for Monsanto or the Farm Bureau or, some of those large companies, and those are the folks that he was threatened in 2000, I forget when the last time he ran, but so a lot of those ag companies and groups were urged to step in and help him because they didn't want the Democrat to win, because God knows what would happen. We used to have Democrats. As Patty Judge was Secretary of Agriculture, and we still had agriculture, so I don't know why they're too worried. But yeah, it's
the corn still grew that year.
It did. It did. We could have had more rain. Weather could have been better. That's always a problem. So yeah, I don't know how large it's going to be. I'm thinking maybe 3 candidates when it shakes out.
Okay.
That are going to either think they have a chance or just they're not smart enough to know they don't.
I was going to say that's what it ended up being, because I went and checked what it was in 2010, because that would be the best comparison to now. And when it came time to the official ballot for the Republican primary, it was 3 people. It was Terry Branstad, Rod Roberts, and Bob Vanderplaats.
Yeah, and Bob was running for his 3rd time. Well, he was Jim Nestle's running mate in 2006.
Yep.
The only to that comparison, I'm curious, Todd. Did Branstad's entry into that primary winnow the field a little bit, because he wasn't an incumbent, obviously, but he had been governor previously? I don't know how well you remember that time, Todd, or was that a genuinely wide open primary?
Well, I think Branstad was pretty far ahead from the beginning.
Yeah.
I think maybe Vanderplaats might have had, as being sort of in the religious conservative lane.
Right.
Second reference. He may have gotten more support. And, Rod Roberts, I think he was, ended up getting like 10% or something like that.
But I mean, do you think more people might have tried to run if it hadn't been?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think, And that's the people who recruited him to run in 2010 were worried that Vanderplaats would win the Republican nomination for governor and that he would lose the general election.
Among the people who recruited him, by the way, State Senator Mike Busolo.
Yeah, well, he was Branstad's chief of staff for a
while.
He
got himself a job there after having done that work to get him to run. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. So you think, Todd, to summarize then, it sounds like you think a lot of them will go through this sort of exploratory due diligence phase, but when it comes to it, the actual number of candidates won't be super big. We won't have an Iowa caucus.
Yeah, it's not going to be like the Senate 2014 Senate primary where we had 8 candidates.
Was it that many?
Well, Whitaker was in it, and
right. This will be fun. Okay,
the businessman from Des Moines area, is it
Ernst? Obviously,
Ernst
Whitaker
was in it.
Sam Clovis.
Sam Clovis.
Yeah, the business from, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah,
Todd,
the guy who was kind of seen as the favorite for a little while.
Yeah. Until the pigs started squealing.
Yeah, until the castrating started, and then that she kind of castrated the field, I guess. But yeah, that was a big primary. I think, like I say, I think there's probably room for a few candidates. I think, maybe the Attorney General's, 39% approval rating last time they asked. and some of the things that she's done. I mean, there could be candidates that think that maybe she's too far to the right, although, I mean, that seems to be your your calling card now, is that
Yeah.
I can't, if I go any further right, I'll be on the left. So coming around the world.
Real quick, did you say 5, Todd? Because that would be right. It was.
No, I said 8.
Oh, 8. Yeah, it wasn't quite that big. It was, well, that made it to
It
the
seemed
ballot.
like 8.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way.
It was 5, and we had everybody. The name we couldn't think of was Mark Jacobs.
Jacobs.
That's who we were trying to think of. And then I forget this coming back to me now. Scott Shaban, who was he was kind of the underdog candidate. I remember Scott now, but he was sort of down the rung as far as the realistic hopes there.
Well, you might as well do it, because the governor's office, the governor's seat doesn't come open very often. I mean, it's just people seem to keep it. Chuck Culver gave it up after one term, but
Yeah.
I mean, so these chances don't come around often. It's maybe 10, 12 years before it happens again.
All right, I want to get us out here as quick as possible because we're already on our longer side. But Todd, real quick, if you don't mind my asking, so and maybe we'll talk about this more next week, but just for the benefit of people, because we're recording Friday afternoon, and this news broke just like maybe a half hour-ish before we hit the record button here, and I'll maybe just get a quick hot take from you, Todd, on this, and maybe we talk more next week. But the Governor Reynolds' office announced that they are suing the Des Moines Register over an open records request that the Register has made. And to summarize this as succinctly as possible, the Register had made an open request for any emails that discussed the whole Lutheran services thing that came up when Reynolds testified before Congress a month or so back, and was pressed on whether she thought she agreed with the former Trump administration officials' assertion that Lutheran Services was a money laundering organization. And so the governor's office returned 800 plus pages of materials to the Register from that request, but withheld 4 pages claiming executive privilege. The Register argued there's no such thing when it comes to an open records request. Reynolds' office says, yes, it does. Here's some Supreme Court precedents. In a sort of proactive legal move, the Reynolds administration announced again Friday that it's suing the Register, basically asking the court to say, no, the governor's office is right. They don't have to produce these 4 pages because of executive privilege. I mean, this is going to be an interesting case to follow. Todd, I'm curious if you have any initial reaction to that.
Well, like you say, it sounds like they're going to court so that the Supreme Court eventually can rule on whether there's executive privilege or
whether
not.
This is a thing, the argument they're making,
yeah,
right?
And they cite a bunch of cases, but if it were a thing, you wouldn't think that they'd have to go to the Supreme Court to try to make it a thing. So
or you wouldn't have to cite cases. You would be able to point to the law or the Constitution.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, they want to say that, they're kind of saying the 825 pages we gave you, and then there were 4 that we didn't. The 4 were the news. That's where all the news was, probably in the 4. I don't think they should have executive privilege, obviously. I think, governors make their living off other people's taxes and our taxes and make public policy. I don't know why they should get to play secret agent, with their staff. But yeah, the lawsuit against the Register, I guess, is that's Republicans just sue the Register now. That's just what they do. You got to find a reason. I hope she doesn't succeed, but it will be interesting to watch whether. Because then what's the scope of it? Every email from an advisor is going to be privileged. I mean, that doesn't seem right.
Yep, and I didn't state that clearly. The 4 pages at the heart of this are emails between Reynolds and her highest staff. It's not even with people outside the office. And so,
if you want to have privileged conversations, go to the person and talk to them. Don't put it in an email. I mean, I can't keep giving these people free lessons
free legal
government.
advice. Free legal advice.
Well, which
again.
is, I mean, that's not good either. But at least, you put it in an email. It's a public record. I mean, you
Yep.
just.
And it bears noting, we'll see where this goes, but this Iowa Supreme Court ruled roughly in favor of open records the last time a big case came before Reynolds when they determined that her office was taking too long in responding to open records requests, and so it's gonna be interesting.
Yeah, it's not a slam dunk. The
Yeah.
Supreme Court will see it that way.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, obviously something that we'll be following and talking about future episodes. We're going to wrap this one up. Thanks for sticking with us so much to talk about, and we could have added another topic or two, but that's going to do it for this episode of On Iowa Politics. If you're not already, please subscribe to us on your streaming service of choice or on YouTube, where you should also smash that like button. And you can find the podcast each week on your preferred Gazette or Lean newspaper website as well. Now that you've listened to the On Iowa Politics podcast, make sure you're also subscribed to the On Iowa Politics newsletter, where every morning in your inbox, you'll receive all the latest politics and government coverage from our team. You can subscribe to that free newsletter at the Gazette's website, thegazette.com. And lastly, don't forget that the work of everyone you heard here today can be found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, Muscatine Journal, Cedar Rapids Gazette, Waterloo, Cedar Falls Courier, Mason City Globe Gazette, Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, and the Sioux City Journal. I'm getting better and better at that with each week. For Tom, Barton, Maya Marchel, Hoff, Sarah Watson, Jared McNett, Todd Dorman, and our producer Bailey Sheehan, the whole happy gang, I'm Erin Murphy. Be well, everyone, and be good.